Welcome to the Coin Stories podcast, where we get to explore the future of money, business, technology, and Bitcoin's revolutionary promise to boost economic prosperity around the world and mend our broken financial system. I'm Natalie Brunell, and I'm here to learn with you. This podcast is for educational and entertainment purposes only. None of the discussions should constitute as official investment advice, and you should always do your own research. Please make sure to subscribe to the show so you don't miss out on any new episodes. This podcast is made possible through partnerships with companies I trust, and I'm very picky about who I choose to partner with, so I hope you take the time to listen to the ad reads throughout the show. Thanks for joining me, and if you like this type of content and want to see more of it, make sure to hit that like button. All right, it's time for the show. Welcome back for another episode, everyone. I'm really excited about this episode because we're going to learn a lot about block space and block scarcity. And here with me is CEO of Barefoot Mining, Bob Burnett. Bob, thank you so much for joining me.
Oh, my pleasure, Natalie. Great to see you.
Your presentation at BitBlockBoom kind of blew me away because it is something that I have not thought about. I knew that the mempool, the memory pool of transactions, was pretty clogged and there were a lot of transactions waiting to be confirmed. But everything that you shared about block space and this other type of scarcity that Satoshi created with Bitcoin, it was just kind of mind-blowing and a little worrisome. So I'm excited to get into that. But first, let's set the scene here and talk a little bit about who you are, how you came to this space. You're originally from the Midwest, like me, so I want to hear a little bit about your background, your upbringing, and I bet your gateway computer journey is pretty interesting. So let's go to the beginning. Where are you from, and what did you do early on?
Well, thank you, Natalie. Yeah, I'm from Wisconsin originally. I grew up in a town called Kenosha, Wisconsin. I was fortunate as a young guy to have some great teachers, and luckily too, I think I was somewhat blessed in terms of just having a lot of mathematical and scientific inclinations. And so I had a teacher. His name was Cornelius Fowler, and he kind of took me under his wing in the late 70s. And so he started getting me programming on computers at that time, and that kind of led to a passion for computing. But computing then was very different than it is now. And so I ended up going to University of Wisconsin, Milwaukee, and getting a degree in computer engineering. And then came out of school, and again, fortune smiled. I went to work in Chicago, in your hometown, for a company called Zenith, which at the time was a very large TV brand.
Yeah, I remember the building near me in the suburbs.
Yes, Milwaukee, off of Milwaukee Avenue, off of 294. So, yep. So, anyway, I was fortunate that they had a personal computer division, and my very first thing, kind of out of school, was to be a member of a team that was designing what we would now, or at least what I would believe to be, the very first laptop computer, and it was just a blessing, right? I mean, it wasn't me that created the idea for it, but I was given this assignment, and it was such a cool thing, to be there at the inception. The personal computer industry was very, very young. We were just trying to start into this world of mobile computing, and that led to me 6 years later, after having done a bunch of engineering and product marketing work for Zenith, to start my own company. And we designed what was called a sub-notebook computer. Our goal, which we succeeded in, was to build a sub 2.2 pounds, which is 1 kilogram, laptop computer that ran Windows. And this was in 1991. And we were fortunate enough to get that product to market, but we didn't have the resources to create a sales team and a support team and all that sort of stuff. And so our only option was to sell that design to some other company, and that other company ended up being Gateway.
Oh, wow.
So kind of summarize that story. Gateway bought the product, but then they bought me and the company basically with it. And so I joined Gateway and moved to South Dakota. This was before Gateway went public. And so I was fortunate to be part of the management team that helped take Gateway public. in 93.
Oh, I bet. And well, you were chief technology officer there, right?
Yeah, yeah. And I became chief technology officer there and was there into the mid 2000s and had just a phenomenal run through the personal computer industry. And obviously, from the start of mobile computing through all the things that happened with the internet, and what a blessing to have been in that spot at such an important time, because a lot like Bitcoin, the personal computer, it changed everything, right? It changed social structures, government structures, the way people did business. I mean, the fundamental implications of it ran really deep. And so to be part of that was, I didn't appreciate it as much as I appreciate it now, even frankly. Like I was in the midst of it, and we knew we were doing things that were important, but we didn't probably really get the whole magnitude of what we were working on.
Oh, I bet. Well, Gateway was actually, I think, my first computer.
Thank you.
I was living in the suburbs of Chicago, and I remember, AOL dial up and the early internet and just playing around. And I had no idea how much these devices and the internet in general was going to transform all of our lives. So, obviously now we're seeing another transformation. What's the biggest lesson when you were going through that, working with computers that were changing the way people did business and the way they communicated? I mean, if you could go back and talk to your younger self when you were working in that space, what's the big lesson and takeaway that you wish you knew then?
Well, I think I would ready myself for the pace of change that the personal computer industry itself, plus all the things that it impacted, have this exponential growth. Like we talk about it in the Bitcoin world a lot, right? That this pace of change, and it's a mind-boggling sort of thing. And what you'll see if you look back on personal computer history is that it's littered with success stories and then implosion, success story and then implosion. So companies and people, by the way, they would find something that resonated for a given period of time, let's say a given company designing a certain product, and then the vast majority of the time they couldn't repeat it and they would implode. And the lesson from that is that you have to continually evolve yourself. You have to continually evolve your organization to keep pace. And you better be ready for the pace of it. You can't take a day off in your evolution. And so if you're running a company, well, you better be constantly upgrading your personnel, whether that's new personnel or education for the current people. It's the processes that you run the organization with have to be continually improving and expanding. The products and services you offer have to be continually evolving, because if you don't, you're going to get absolutely crunched. Like if you,
Right. And we've seen that with like the Kodaks of the world, the
yeah,
Blockbusters. I want to ask you before you share with us your Bitcoin journey and how you got into this space. I'm just curious, you saw Gateway go public. What was your relationship with money at the time? Because I'm assuming that when all of this happened, you kind of were in that place where I've made it. I don't have to worry about money anymore, but you also have to think smart about making sure that you plan for the future and you invest it in the right way, right? Because you can't hold money in cash. So can you talk to me a little bit about your money journey in general,
yeah.
and then how you found
That's
Bitcoin?
a great question. Nobody ever asked me that one, and so I appreciate you asking it, because I think it's important and it's part of my Bitcoin journey. So
Yeah.
I was fortunate. I did do well. I had a bunch of stock and a bunch of stock options, and the stock went crazy. And so the 90s was a phenomenal run for me.
Wow.
That said, I was focused on my job, which was to bring technology to market, right? And like I said, I mean, it was fast paced. Like we had to be bringing products out continually to keep pace. Well, so what I did what I think a lot of people do is I had a big cash out point. I had a pretty good chunk of money, And I said, I'm not going to give it all to one person, but I went to 3 different people who were supposed to be financial / wealth advisors, right? And I gave them each a third.
Oh, wow.
And I said, by the way, this is like 1998. And I went to them and I said, hey, don't lose it. Grow it if you can, but don't lose it, right? That was, and I went away. Like, and that was, by the way, I take responsibility, personal responsibility. I went away and didn't really watch it that closely. So continued doing my job and working. Well, those of you who would remember, there was a bubble in 2001 and 2002 that was the internet bubble that popped, and we had Enron and we had all these sort of things, and it didn't bode well, right? And I looked back after about 5 years at my statements, and I realized that not only had I not made money, I had lost money. Like each of the 3 people I had given this money to had lost money on an absolute basis, and then you put in, the time value of money, and you're really off, right?
Right. Wow.
So, but I gave them. I mean, this is a lesson for Bitcoiners. Like, I gave them that power. I could have managed it myself. I could have done something else, but I chose to empower a third party to do this for me, and they messed up. So that actually began for me. It's just a little sidelight. I also have a background in economics, so I also studied economics in school, and I have a minor degree in economics, and I had continued studying it throughout, and I became disillusioned with Wall Street. And there's some reasons. Being a public company, also, I became very disillusioned with Wall Street, interfacing with them on a daily basis. I lost a tremendous amount of respect for the institutions in Wall Street through this process too. I realized that they were greedy, that they were more than willing to twist facts and mislead people to gain financial advantage. It became very, very obvious that that's the way Wall Street worked. So I started digging, and I found Austrian economics. So this would have been like that same time period, early 2000s of that same decade. So obviously I didn't know Bitcoin was coming, but it certainly prepared me for Bitcoin and made me fertile ground for being a Bitcoin advocate, because I had the ability technically to absorb what was going on, but also the way that the economic theory behind Bitcoin really resonated with me.
You know what's interesting about what you shared? You, like you said, you were focused on your company and building, and you had this money, and even folks who are super successful, they trust their money with these so-called wealth advisors, right? Because we've financialized everything, and it doesn't guarantee that they're going to be able to hold on to it. And those, I don't know what banks, you put it in, but they're all doing the same thing essentially,
Yep.
right? They're trying to game the stock market, and obviously there's like real estate and then gold and diversify and all of that. And that's what you have to do because our money's broken.
Yeah, exactly. And so that's when I had the realization that money was broken came to me 20 years ago when that happened. I didn't know what to do about it.
So
then.
how did you find Bitcoin?
Well, so I came in through the back door. I have I don't know if I can say it here, but an altcoin story that starts with.
No,
But
yeah, a lot of
but
people, yeah.
but
That's how
I'm
we
not there
start.
today. Just we'll say that to begin with. But I came in through it as a computer guy. My story goes like this. In 2017, I was at home one night, and it was about 9 o'clock, and my cell phone rang, and it was a phone call from Seattle, Washington, but with no name. And I showed the phone to my wife, and I said, "I'm not picking this up." And Lola, who I think you've met, she's a very instinctual person. She said, "No, answer that phone." I said, "I don't want to." She said, "Answer it." Okay, I answered it. But it turned out to be a guy that I had worked with 10 years before at Gateway. I hadn't talked to for a long time. And he said, "Bob, do you remember me?" And I did. He said, hey, I'm working with a group. We're putting up an Ethereum mining farm, but we need 300 Ethereum mining servers, and we can't find anybody that can design and build them. Can you do that? So, make a long story short, I said, well, I guess. But I looked at it as a computer guy, right? Somebody's basically asking me
Sure.
to build 300 computers. That probably cost like $6,500 each. So it was like, he wants to buy $2 million of computers. So, okay, I guess I'll be happy to build those for you, right? And I did. So fast forward to fulfilling that order, we had this design, and I said, "Oh, I wonder if anybody else would like to buy this." And another little tangent: I have a long relationship that goes with NVIDIA, the company NVIDIA. Gateway in the early '90s was the very first company to design an NVIDIA chip onto a computer. So we were their first
Oh,
customer.
wow.
So when they were a
Wow.
tiny startup, so Jensen, who's the CEO there, I know Jensen. Keith Thomas, who's my right hand man and president of Barefoot Mining, was the head of desktop engineering at Gateway, and so we called them up and said, "Hey, will you guys supply chips to us? We're just this tiny company, but hopefully you remember us." And they did, and they were grateful for the opportunity we gave them when they got started, and so they said, "They'll give us the chips." So we started designing these or building these Ethereum machines for other people, but almost everybody that bought one or expressed interest in one said, "I'll only buy it from you if you will host it for me." So so and these were maybe a chiropractor that wanted 10 of them, and an accountant that wanted 3, and somebody else that, so it wasn't massive volumes, but it was enough. And so, ironically, um, Gateway's headquarters, which had been in South Dakota, Gateway had been bought by Acer and had vacated that building. And so we rented the old Gateway data center, and we put Ethereum mining operation inside the data center of the old Gateway facility.
Wow.
Anyway,
And
we're
what year
still
was
in
this?
2017.
Okay. Okay. Wow.
So, and by the way, we're still in that building. We have a lot of other places too, but we're still in that building, in that space today. Which it's kind of nostalgic for me. It's
So
kind of
you
a neat
shifted it
thing.
to a Bitcoin mining facility.
Yeah, yeah. So
That's
the old
awesome.
Gateway headquarters is now a Bitcoin mining facility.
Oh,
So
cool.
yeah, so we so we did that for a while, and then, but again, I was looking at it through the eyes of a person trying to sell computers, and then
Hmm.
and we were doing well. When I finally had a chance to breathe, though, I started to look at Ethereum more deeply, and red flags started to go up. Um, First on a technical level, they were already starting the proof of stake narrative. I started looking at the way that the system was constructed, and it looked overly complex and unlikely to come together in the way that they thought it would come together. So that was the CTO part of me saying something doesn't look
Sure.
right. And then we looked at the monetary policy of it and said, so the Austrian in me started saying, nope, I don't like that. And then I started looking deeper at, of course, the logical alternative, Bitcoin,
Hmm.
and realized that it didn't have these faults. And so we pivoted the company. We signed an agreement with Bitfury to become the US distributor for Bitfury's mining equipment, and started building our own Bitcoin mining operations, selling that equipment to host for others, and then funding and building our own mining operations. And so
Wow.
that's how we got into that business. And so the first step was this Ethereum hop, and then the orange pill would have been about a year later in 2018.
It's time for a quick break to hear these messages from my partners. First up, Bitcoin Amsterdam. The biggest Bitcoin conference in Europe is just around the corner. The second annual event will be held October 12th and 13th and bring together speakers from around the world, including the one and only Edward Snowden, Stella Assange, Balaji, Eva Vlardingerbroek, and so many more. Get your tickets with a 10% discount using code HODL. And don't forget to get your early bird pass to Bitcoin Nashville 2024. You're going to get the best price right now. And again, use code HODL for that discount. I'll see you there. Next up, Fold. Fold is the best Bitcoin rewards debit card and shopping app in the world. You can earn Bitcoin on everything you purchase, from Amazon to groceries to your Bitcoin conference ticket, with Fold's Bitcoin cashback debit card. And you can play to win free Satoshis or even a whole Bitcoin by spinning the rewards wheel. This is a great app to get someone totally new into Bitcoin. And it's way better than earning reward airline miles and hotel points. Head to foldapp.com/Natalie and you'll get 10,000 Satoshis when you sign up for Spin or Spin Plus and spend at least $20 on the card. All right, back to the show. Well, I mean, that's a quick journey, to discovering that Bitcoin is the one that actually has those monetary properties that we're all seeking and is really the future. So that's the genesis of Barefoot Mining.
Yes.
That's what it was always called.
Yes.
Okay, so this is really interesting because, as you mentioned, if you were studying Bitcoin's monetary policy, the scarcity aspect, obviously so important. And during 2017 was also the Blocksize wars. So I'm kind of curious, were you sort of following that? And let's move the conversation into this very important topic that you've been trying to, share awareness about, which is that yes, Bitcoin is scarce in terms of the amount of units that there will ever be, the amount of Bitcoin, but it also has block scarcity, which nobody really talks about. So why is it such an important topic that you decided to look into?
Well, the first thing I think you asked about was in like 2017, 2018, as the Blocksize wars were going on. I was aware of them. I didn't have a horse in the race during the critical period. And so it was only probably toward the latter part of 2018, I think, after it had somewhat been solidified that, I saw the light properly and jumped on. I was more kind of ambivalent to which one would have won in those days. Again, because I was thinking as a computer guy, not a Bitcoin. So my story there is that as a miner, I take my responsibility like really seriously about being a miner. It's not just a business for me. I look at what I do in mining and what I hope, but I honestly don't believe a lot of other mining companies do, is I believe we have a key role in the protection and the integrity of the base layer. And that as miners, we must operate within the ethos of Bitcoin and protect the integrity of that base layer above all else. That we should not be prioritizing short-term gains or other priorities. Even things like grid stability and those sort of things do not take precedence over the integrity of the base layer itself. And so I really dove in deep technically, like how does the base layer work? What are the dynamics of it? I certainly went back and studied closely what was happening with the Blocksize war. And over the course of that time, a realization started to come forth, which you've highlighted already, and that's the fact that while Bitcoin itself is absolutely scarce, the 21 million, interestingly, block space is also absolutely scarce. That we have 10-minute block times that, close to 10-minute block times. We can go into that a little bit later. But we have basically 10-minute block times, and we have a block size, which is 4 million weight units, but we won't worry about that right now. It's basically like 1.5 to 2 megabytes. That's it. So every 10 minutes, there's that much space available to cram as many transactions in as possible. And then we move to the next one. What that means is that if you give me any period of time, whether that's the next 10 minutes or the next year, that there's only so much we can put in that space. So Bitcoin block space is absolutely scarce in any time window you choose. And to put that in terms that probably are a little easier to understand, 4 million weight units, which is the technical way of describing a block, translates to about 2,700 transactions. So if we look at the last year, 2,700 transactions is the average amount that will fit in. And every block is full, by the way. So you mentioned the mempool. People probably look at that, and that's certainly a good place to look. Like if you just want a quick glance of how busy and active is Bitcoin, yeah, go look at the mempool, and you'll see right now it's 300 and something thousand transactions in the backlog here on whatever today is, September 13th. But if you look back over the last 6 months, not just because of ordinals, we are completely stuffed. Every single block is completely full. And so, and it contains about 2,700 transactions. Well, if you do some math with that, what you find out is that in any given year, there's only so many blocks per year, and there's 2,700 transactions per block. That comes out to about 140 million transactions. That's it. So we could do some things more as users, and maybe there's a few technical improvements we could make that could squeeze a little bit more capacity out of that. I believe it'll probably max out about 200 million. That's about the best that we can do. So,
well, I saw that in your presentation, and it really did make me think, because you pointed out during that time that there are like 300 million businesses out there. There are 8 billion people. I mean, for them to all use Bitcoin, basically what you were saying is that they won't be able to use it on the base layer, and that the fees will just become too restrictive. So essentially, we need these layer 2 applications, and we need to be able to scale through things like Lightning and Fedimint, because basically you're saying that in the future, you won't be able to use, an average person will not be able to use the base layer. Is that correct?
That's correct. Yeah, the math is just there. 200 million people, or 200 million transactions across, you had the right stats, 8 billion people and 300 million companies. I mean, mathematically, it basically says maybe in the lifetime of a typical person, they will do a handful of base layer interactions. That's it. And by the way, a movement onto the base layer counts as one, and a movement off of the base layer counts as one. So that's, it's not 200 million each way. That's it. So it's very finite. And at least it's my prediction, others may disagree, it's my prediction that we are on the cusp of face melting fees on an ongoing basis. There's a lot of people that say, well, will the mempool ever clear again? Maybe, maybe not. I don't think so, but some people think it might. But even if it does, if we believe Bitcoin adoption is going to follow the path that we all, I think, are here believing in, then mathematically, it means that there isn't room for everybody. And as you said, Fedimint, Lightning, Liquid, pick whatever, hopefully some other things even emerge over time on layer 2 and layer 3. But that's where the world has to live.
Okay, I want to dive into some of the things you shared more deeply. But first, let's just let's kind of go back to the basics for the people that are watching this who are less technical or maybe total newcomers, and let's just go over some of the things that I think everyone needs to know. We had the Blocksize wars back in 2017 because there was a movement essentially to increase the block size, right, to allow for more transactions, and there was this kind of big scare that Bitcoin can't scale unless we do this. But the average nodes, the plebs, all of us average people, we won out, right, in that. And can you talk a little bit about why that was so important? Because you are worried that maybe there is going to be a second block size wars, and it's not going to be about size this time. It's going to be about block time, the block time wars. So can you talk a little bit about that as well?
Yes. So a fundamental premise of Bitcoin is that each person can, for a very small amount of money, run a full node. And that means that you can not only interact with the miners and accept blocks, but you can hold an entire history of the entire blockchain. Bitcoin philosophically was built around this fact, and it moves the power of the network to the edge, to the nodes, to the plebs. Other coins, for instance, Ethereum, are already at a point where running the equivalent of a full node in their network can only be done in like an Amazon data center. It's tens of thousands of dollars of equipment, and it requires technical capabilities that are well beyond the average person. So by definition, it has become centralized and controllable. And so for Bitcoin to remain decentralized and free and independent, this is critical. So in 2017, in the Blocksize wars that we talked about before, there were people who were saying, well, Bitcoin cannot scale so that you can buy your coffee. Everybody can't buy coffee every day because it can't process enough transactions on the base layer. That's true. Bitcoin's answer to it is we move that type of activity to a higher layer, Lightning being the most prevalent one. Others in Bitcoin Cash and Bitcoin SV, they still believe, obviously they're in a very big minority now, that should all occur at the base layer. So if we want to stay decentralized and we want to keep the power on the edge and the power with the plebs, then we must keep the integrity of this block space such that it doesn't cause us to go off the deep end and force the plebs out.
But you think that, with these financial institutions coming in, that there could be another push in even the next couple of years, maybe within the next 10 years, saying, hey, we need to reduce the amount of block time. So maybe every 5 minutes there's a block being mined. Do you really think that's a threat?
It's a threat. I hope it doesn't happen. Getting and talking to people like you on shows like this, I hope is part of preventing that. And so people can say, why did that Bob Burnett guy ever even say that? That was never going to happen. Well, here's why I think the possibility exists. I believe we will move to a time when, as we said, the average person does not interact with the base layer. It's primarily being done by large financial institutions. I believe they will want to control the base layer as much as possible. In other words, they can decide what transactions go into a block, and they can also, have more control over the cost of including those transactions in the block. The scarcer the block space is, the harder it is for them to do that. And the more their cost of doing business goes up. So I think it's only logical that they would say, well, how do we increase the capacity of the base layer and of the block space? Well, we've already had the block size war, and that was settled. So there's only one other variable in the equation, which is how fast are blocks processed. So in Bitcoin, we have a difficulty adjustment that tries to reset the network to about 10 minutes. But if we were to speed that up, of course, it effectively increases the transaction, the effective block space available. So I believe that there's a high likelihood that at some point we're going to start seeing these financial institutions who are not Bitcoin purists. I don't expect them to ever live the ethos of Bitcoin. They're going to live their Wall Street fiat mentality. And to them, this is going to seem logical. And I will point out that their argument will get probably easier for them with time, or at least apparently easier with time, because right now what happens is if we were to suddenly cut the block time in half today, well, what would that mean? It would mean that we would be releasing new Bitcoin through the subsidy into the ecosystem at twice the rate, right? And that would greatly suppress the price. However, 2 or 3 halving cycles from now, we're at a point where the subsidy starts approaching zero. People talk about the last one being mined in 2140, but the reality is, in 10 years, we've essentially mined it all, right? And so we'll be at a point where we're at like 0.78 Bitcoin per block being released as part of the subsidy. And so they can say, well, we can increase the block time, and even though it will increase the rate at which money is coming into the system, it's such an insignificant amount, it doesn't matter. In other words, we'll double a very small inflation rate. Today, the inflation rate is still
Well,
too high.
and I guess it all depends, right? What is 0.78 of a Bitcoin at that point where we're at in the price cycle? But you bring up, another important point that everyone should be aware of, right? There's the block subsidy that the miners get, but also the fees. And right now, because space is so scarce, they prioritize obviously the highest fees. And I know that people watching this might be thinking about that $500,000 fee that ended up in in one of the blocks in the last week, but that was an error, right? I think they've revealed that it was PayPal that accidentally did that. But basically, the more you pay, the faster your transactions get confirmed. Can you kind of talk a little bit about, seeing them pile up to over 300,000? What do you say to people out there who are like, how is that sustainable?
Well, are you talking about the size of the mempool, Natalie, or the? Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, so here's a couple things. So the first one is that you're correct in that largely the transactions which have the highest fees associated with them get processed first. However, it doesn't have to be that way. So the on a technical basis, and I'll try to give it at a very high level, what happens is every time a block is mined, the mining pools of the world, currently the mining pools of the world, go look at the remaining transactions. Right now it's 300,000. And they can pick whatever ones they want out of that group. Now, you'd say the economic motivation would be to pick the most expensive ones, but not necessarily, because, for instance, if you and I were part of a company and one of our transactions happened to be in the mempool, we would actually put it in at the lowest fee and then try to mine that one so that and so, by the way, Binance does that. Binance is one of the bigger pools and one of the bigger miners. And so they don't mine typically the most expensive ones. They mine all of theirs and then they pick the more expensive ones with whatever is left.
Got it.
So what we have to be careful of, and I don't mean this to scare anybody, I just try to let people be aware, because we have a lot of control as plebs, and as long as we're aware of what's going on, like one of the fears is, if you look at, let's say, a BlackRock, because we talk a lot about BlackRock today, is we don't want them to disrupt the integrity of the choices of what goes into the mempool, or what goes into a block creation. So if they gain too much power over that, let's say they went and bought a large percentage of the mining companies of the world, that could give them that kind of power. A lot of people have talked about things like 51% attacks. That's to me a very unlikely attack vector ever. The attack vector is more kind of a censorship or a disruption of the natural priority scheme, and which is kind of an attack on the integrity of the system, as opposed to something
Right.
like, it's not apparently malicious, but it has a negative long-term effect.
It's time for another quick break to hear these messages from my partners. Next up, Coinkite, which offers everything you need to safely take custody of your Bitcoin. Coinkite produces the ColdCard wallet, which is the cold storage device I use for safekeeping my Bitcoin. You can verify the source code, it's ultra secure, and it's easy to use, even if you're a beginner. Head to their website in my show notes to find all of their custody products, cold cards in different colors, seed phrase plates, tap signers, block clocks, and more. And you'll get a 5% discount with my link. Become your own bank with Bitcoin and Coinkite. Next up, I want to share with you about CrowdHealth. Health insurance costs are sky high today, and you send your money every month to a fiat corporation only to never see that money again, even if you don't get sick. But if you do need care, you end up having to pay even more out of pocket. But luckily, there's an alternative, and it's all about community. CrowdHealth brings together Bitcoiners who crowdfund each other's healthcare. So you no longer have to pay fiat health insurance companies. You get to actually help other Bitcoiners, and they help you in return. So how it works is, when you need a doctor or hospital visit, CrowdHealth negotiates down the medical bill lower than what insurance would be, and the community helps you cover the costs. You get to save the money you would have sent to an insurance company. And hey, why not put it into Bitcoin? To sign up, head to joincrowdhealth.com/Natalie. All right, next up, I'm excited to share that I am an advisor for the Orange Pill app. If you haven't downloaded this app yet, then you're missing out on connecting with Bitcoiners in your area. The Orange Pill app is focused on building the social layer for Bitcoin and helping create opportunities for in-person connections and community building. You create a profile and you'll see lots of familiar faces, and then you can search for Bitcoiners and Bitcoin events based on your location. Come join us and use the referral link in my show notes to start connecting today. But as far as the transactions waiting to be verified, I mean, can that keep just piling up and up and up, or what solves this issue? Because one thing that you also said is we really took for granted the people who were very early on. There were blocks that were mined that were pretty much empty. I mean, like they weren't full, right? And now they're just, I mean, there's just like a line waiting, right? So how do we fix this?
Well, the first is get comfortable with layer 2 solutions. So a lot of those transactions that are sitting in the mempool probably could be handled in Lightning. And so I would say number one, if you're not using Lightning, go get a wallet, get a Lightning node. If after a while, get comfortable transacting with Lightning, because sending $50 of Bitcoin to somebody on the base layer is just not going to happen in the future. It's just, in fact, we'll call those kinds of transactions dust, meaning that the cost of the transaction is higher than the cost or the value of the Bitcoin being moved. So,
well, that's what I was going to ask you. I mean, because a lot of people see this as their long-term store of value to someday purchase a house, to retire, to pay for their children's education. So you're saying that, within our lifetime, there's going to be a situation where, let's say you saved maybe even just it's one Bitcoin, right? That's a lot of people's dream, is to have one Bitcoin, that they won't be able to transact with that Bitcoin because the fee to actually transact will be higher than what the Bitcoin is worth?
Well, I would be flabbergasted if one Bitcoin was above the threshold. But if you have, let's say, 0.001 Bitcoin sitting kind of by itself in a UTXO or in a wallet, yeah, you should ultimately be concerned about that. So, I mean, that would be like 0.001 would be like $25 worth of Bitcoin, right? I mean, that will almost certainly fall under the threshold. In fact, even 0.01 is probably going to fall under the threshold in our lifetime. And this could even happen in the next 10 years, because the truth of the matter is that, well, I shouldn't say the truth of the matter. My opinion is that not only in our lifetimes, but within the next decade, and probably even within this decade, the 2020s, that we're going to feel the effects of this. That mempool 300,000 backlog is going to look small because it's going to be several million. And eventually it'll fall back down because people will be tired of waiting and they'll move it to other layers. But also remember that Lightning itself requires base layer interaction. So the Lightning node and the Lightning channels, they have to resolve at the base layer. Fedi, if you're in a Fedi group, it has to have certain abilities to resolve at the base layer. So even you move some of the work up to a higher layer, but it doesn't go away. So if you're out there, don't be afraid to score on the base layer, but do it in an amount that's meaningful. And so I'm just going to throw a crude number out there, but I'd say, if you have about 1/10 of a Bitcoin or more, at least for now, I think you're okay at the base layer. But if you get down below amounts below that, and you need quick access to that money, then you might want to move it somewhere else, because and I know it's a scary thing, because the mantra within our community is not your keys, not your coin. Don't trust. We even talked about that already ourselves, about not trusting. But there's some practical things here that just we have to face the reality of. And as you said, I said in that talk at BitBlock Boom that Satoshi, and I think it was brilliant, when he created the subsidy, he was not only subsidizing the miners, but he was subsidizing the entire community by giving us access to this base layer, which I believe will ultimately be the most precious real estate in the world, like virtual or physical. The most precious real estate in the world will be block space, a spot on the blockchain.
Well, a lot of people say that self-custody, that the technical component, a lot of people are intimidated to try to, take their own keys and be their own bank. But it sounds like you're saying that most people won't be able to hold their own keys because they just won't be able to afford to. Is that the case?
They won't be able to afford to, and especially afford it within a time horizon that works for them. So, if you're storing money for your children or your grandchildren, that's probably okay. But if you're storing money because you're going to need to buy a car or a house at some point in the not too distant future, and you'll need very quick liquidity on it, well, you may only get that liquidity by paying an exorbitant fee. And it may take days or weeks or maybe never to get it at a rate that's reasonable.
Do you see a future where people are just borrowing against their Bitcoin because it has appreciated to such a level that they never even have to interact with the base layer because they could just use it as collateral?
Yes, absolutely. I think that's, again, something that I think is often thought of in a sacrilegious way, but just speaking practically, go back to those numbers. There's only 200 million of those interactions for 8 billion people.
Right.
It doesn't work. So if you have 30 Bitcoin, let's say you're fortunate enough to have 30 Bitcoin and you want to buy a house and a down payment on a house, it's probably much more practical to figure out some sort of solution where you collateralize that and go buy the house than it is to actually use that Bitcoin to buy the house.
Well, one thing that you told people is to consolidate their addresses, find the stray ones, and figure out what you need to maybe spend in the near term versus what you want to hold for the long term, given that fees are going to increase. Can you expand on any of that? What should people know? And do you see this as potentially a threat to Bitcoin? For anyone watching this that says, this could be a potential this could mean the downfall of Bitcoin in the future. What do you say to that?
Well, let me answer that first. No, it is not the downfall of Bitcoin. This is the way it has to be. And I think people that have put a lot of thought into this realize that it is the proper construction of the ecosystem. What people have to get comfortable with are these layer 2 solutions, and we go back to, like, hey, get comfortable with Lightning, get comfortable with Fedi, get comfortable with Liquid. Things like that are just paramount, and they are the way Bitcoin is supposed to work. We have a layered structure, and that's what's supposed to happen.
Mm-hmm. People on Bitcoin Twitter talk about the security budget, but it sounds like if fees are going to be that high, that Bitcoin as a network will remain secure because the miners will have that incentive. Is that what you're saying?
I have no security budget concerns. I think that's a complete fallacy. I think it is driven often by people from the altcoin community, the Ethereum, Solana, Cardano crews who try to poke holes at Bitcoin, and that's the only thing that I think they have at this moment that they think is credible. And I think to a person that has put less thought into it, it can sound scary. But the reality is this: a couple of realities. One is, it's interesting. I did a study. I presented it at Bitcoin Boom too. But if you look at the entire history of Bitcoin, the average amount of fees per block is 0.335 Bitcoin. And in the last 6 months, it's 0.335. In other words, amazingly, as we've gone through time, fees have stayed stable, even though the subsidy has fallen. So now, the second thing is, we've had very few periods with full mempools. And we are starting to experience it now. We saw in May and June what happens. And, it's always important to note that scarcity works in a funny way. Like, I give this example, like if you happen to have an apple tree, it's the only apple tree in the world, and it produces 100 apples a day. If only 90 people a day want apples, then the price of apples is close to free. But the moment 101 people want apples, the price starts skyrocketing. By the time 120 people want apples, the price is through the stratosphere. So I believe where we are is we're at a point right now where we have demand for like 98 or 99 or 101 apples. We kind of vary right in that range today. It doesn't take much to where, if the demand for block space is equivalent to the demand for 105 or 110 apples, that's why I say the fees will be face melting. And the miners won't care about the subsidy anymore. They're going to care only about the fees.
Wow. It's, like I said at the start of this, I had not thought about a lot of this. I knew that that there were a lot of transactions sort of in that pool waiting to be processed and all of that, but I just didn't think about how much we have taken for granted the block space that we had access to and how low the fees have been on the base layer for the last many years. So I guess things are going to be changing. When you say that 200 million transactions per year throughput, can you put that into context in terms of, we obviously know there's 8 billion people, potential, Bitcoin holders, but as far as like the payment rails that we're more familiar with, the credit cards, the Swift payment rails, and the transactions that are happening in the fiat world, how different is the 200 million per year versus what happens in fiat today?
So it's roughly analogous to Fedwire. So Fedwire processes almost exactly the same amount of transactions. So this would be mainly the bank-to-bank level interactions that occur on an annual basis. It happens to be about identical to that. I don't remember off the top of my head like a Visa or MasterCard, but I know it's like
a lot more.
billion. Like it's a massive number. And the base, there's nothing we could do to the base layer. We could say move block times to 1 minute and double the block space, and we still couldn't do it, right?
I will not.
So don't try. I mean, but I think what's very interesting is that we're roughly analogous to the bank, to the Fedwire transaction throughput. And you think about what happens there. Well, they're not moving $30. They're moving hundreds of thousands, millions, tens of millions of dollars on a bank-to-bank basis. And that's ultimately what will happen is, we will end up in the same space. And at the Lightning layer, we can go replace or complement the Visas and the MasterCards and the PayPals, those aspects of the economy.
So when you look into the future, I mean, how do you see Bitcoin? Do you think that it will be a global reserve asset? Do you think it will be embraced as a medium of exchange thanks to the scaling layers? I mean, what 10, 15, 20 years from now, what is Bitcoin in the world?
I'm very optimistic. I believe that we look at the optics the wrong way, those of us living in the Western world and the developed world. So I believe it will be led from the second and third world and the developing world, that it will move rapidly from store of value to medium of exchange to unit of account in those sort of places. And then those economies collectively working that way will then force the first world kind of into that same boat. So there's an interesting thing we mentioned early on that I was chief technology officer at Gateway. Well, one of the components of my job was to look at technology and predict how it would adapt in society. And for modern history, like post-World War II history, technology always was led out of the United States. So whatever it was, television adoption, radios, microwave ovens, like all these sort of things were led first in the US and then they filtered through to the rest of the world. there was, when the internet, after the internet, it flipped. And what I ended up doing was, this should have been like in the very late 90s and the early 2000s. What I found in my job was, if I wanted to see where technology was coming, I had to go to other countries and immerse myself in their lifestyle and understand what was happening. So, two quick examples. One was, we saw in right around the year 2000, we saw gaming explode in Korea. Online gaming exploded in Korea. What they had done in Korea was, they have all these apartment buildings, and they had brought fiber to the apartment buildings. So they had much faster internet more quickly than those of us in the US. And you saw this massive explosion of the online gaming market there. And so I went there and I studied it. And like, even 20 years ago in Korea, the best gamers were celebrities on par with a Michael Jordan or a Kobe Bryant. Like, they were celebrities. They had TV shows and TV channels dedicated to online gaming, and it foretold what was going to happen. Another example relates to my wife, who's originally from the Philippines. I got this study once, and this is again the same time period. And I found this study that at the time, the average American was receiving like 1.5 texts per day. But in the Philippines, the average person was sending or receiving 22. I go, what is this? Like, why is this? And especially in the case of the Philippines, which is generally would be considered a third world country, like, they're leading the world in text messaging. What's going on? No, and so without going into any more detail on that, what we've seen is that these kind of places now lead in these technology adoptions. You know, I think they see it faster because the problem they have is so apparent. It's almost like our good fortune causes us to get lazy and to not push for these technological adoptions at the rate that El Salvador or the Philippines or Korea or a place like that does.
Right. Well, that kind of leads me to my last question. Your handle on X or Twitter, whatever you want to call it these days, is Boomer BTC, right? I just came from a conference where I talked about Bitcoin and shared sort of the 101 message with a lot of folks in they're sort of at the tail ends of their careers, thinking about retirement and taking care of their families. Many of them were, boomers, and they seem more hesitant because honestly, fiat kind of worked for them. So why, to the boomers out there, why Bitcoin?
Well, first, from a selfish perspective, if you want to protect what you already have, you got to have a bet on Bitcoin, at least a partial bet on Bitcoin, because you're other people said it before me, but you're shorting Bitcoin whether you know it or not, and that's a very dangerous place to be personally. More importantly, though, and I think this is what drives me, is I have kids. They're all grown. I mentioned to you I had one of my daughters got married this weekend, and I have 5 grandchildren, another one on the way. So I think about their world, and I don't see anything else in the world that gives me hope for their future like Bitcoin. And I mean that from not only a wealth perspective, but a freedom perspective, keeping society on the true and fair path. And so I do what I do because of them. I mentioned this to somebody earlier. I have one of my daughters is pregnant.
Oh,
And
congratulations.
and so, yeah, thank you. So, and that'll be, my 6th grandchild. And I think about, well, that child's going to be born in the year 2024. He or she will be living into the next century. His or her kids will be here when the last Bitcoin is mined. Like, those sort of things are happening. And so I do what I do. I tell the stories I tell, whether they're about block space or things like that, because at the end of the day, I think what we're trying to build is money for 1,000 years. And we have to be aware. Like, so I may say things that you think are, you or others may think are not things to worry about, but I'm worrying about them because I want to build the infrastructure to last 1,000 years. And so something that's a 0.1% chance of happening is a big threat when applied over 1,000 year period.
Mm-hmm.
And so we can't get complacent. We can't, and as long as we don't, I don't believe we have a I don't believe we have a threat as long as we don't get complacent and we don't get lazy. But there are those who want to damage us, and then there are those who are willing to sacrifice what we have and what Bitcoin stands for their own gain. They don't necessarily want it to die, but if given the choice between themselves becoming phenomenally wealthy and Bitcoin succeeding, they'll choose themselves being phenomenally wealthy. And so we have to know that that's the reality of human nature and the reality of the world. And we as a community can fight that, though. And I'm very confident we'll win.
Well, Bob, that's really well said. And, it makes me think about how Satoshi was such a long-term thinker and also very aware of some of the worst parts of human nature and designed Bitcoin in such a way that it can survive some of the challenges that may be ahead of us that we haven't even thought of. So thank you so much. This has been such a great conversation. Hopefully we'll have you back on, and I'm sure I'll get tons of questions and comments about all the things you said. So thanks so much, Bob.
Thank you, Natalie.
Thank you so much for checking out the video version of my show. If you want to see more content like this, make sure you're subscribed to the channel and hit like on the video. And please reach out with feedback or guest suggestions. My email is natalie@talkingbitcoin.com. I'll see you next time.